The Karuka was a type of plow that they used in the High Middle Ages. These people would cooperate with each other very well. It reminds me of what America was like in its earlier days. And what these farmers would do was they'd loan each other horses. So today they plow Farmer Jack's farm, and Farmer Jack would borrow horses from Farmer Joe and Farmer Jim and Farmer John and whatever, and they'd all put their horses together, and they'd get teams of maybe 10 or 20 horses to pull a plow called a Karuka. And the horses could pull them faster than oxen. The oxen were strong, but they were slow. The horses were faster. The farms resembled long, long strips of bacon because it would be faster to plow if they would go a long way before they finally turned all these 20 horses around, and that took some doing, and then plowed the other way, and then turned these horses around again and plowed the other way. So they plowing looked from the air like long strips of bacon. Farming became a community effort. Now, these good times did not last, but each family had to contribute and then reap the collective benefits. And the farmers would help each other farm but they did not farm collective fields, you understand. In other words, the farmers, each one of them owned their own fields during much of this time. Again, collective farming has been tried by communists in places like the Soviet Union and China with disastrous results. Collective farming means the state owns the land and everybody's expected to pitch in and work. And when all the produce then goes to the state and the state redistributes it, it doesn't work. It leads to millions upon millions of people starving. In the Soviet Union, I believe the figure got to 25 million. In China, about 25 million more. But the farmers, each one of them owned their own land, but they would help each other plow their land and help each other in times of planting and harvest. Now, they learned also that they might have learned from the Chinese to put the harness on the horse's shoulder rather than on his neck. You can imagine one time that the horse would have his harness on his neck and he would be expected to pull a plow with a harness on its neck. Well, they realized that the horse could pull a lot more weight if its harness were down. So this seems obvious, but Europeans were slow at learning that. The Chinese were expected to, the Chinese are believed to have been the ones who invented the shoulder harness, to put that harness down on the horse's shoulder instead of on its neck. I saw a cartoon many years ago that said horses would have the last laugh if they could see humans being strapped into a shoulder harness. But anyway, today it's humans that are strapped into shoulder harness, not so much horses. The iron horseshoe also came into widespread use. And again, any of you know anything about horses? The horseshoe enables a horse to pull a bigger load, carry a heavier weight, and move altogether faster than he otherwise would have. They began to use iron a lot, and a lot of the iron they used, folks, again, possibly came up from Africa. Africa was more involved in the world's history than had been believed before modern times. But this iron would probably be mined and melted in Africa, brought to Europe, and they used it to make swords, to make armor, now to make axes, hoes, and hammers and nails. And I'm going to use another word, a scythe. Be honest, how many of you know what a scythe is? Oh, 1, 2, all right. A scythe is like a long sickle, but it's operated. It has a handle down here, and then you hold it with the other hand up here, and you cut your wheat. You can cut your wheat without bending over. The problem is it's very back twisting. If you do it enough, you might throw your back out of joint. Of course, in those days, maybe they had better backs than we do. But the scythe was a tool used for cutting wheat, cutting oats, cutting barley, used in harvest time. This was the High Middle Ages we're talking about. They began to build dams to control flooding, and also the dams would turn water wheels, and they would get their power from water power. Windmills were set up, and I have to jump to modern times. The windmill is coming back into fashion a lot because we're using windmills to generate electricity. It's not a dependable way to generate electricity because sometimes the wind doesn't blow and sometimes the wind blows harder than it does at other times. But nevertheless, you'll see windmills set up some places where we're now using wind to generate electricity. Farmers began to drain swamps. Again, I have to jump to modern times. Swamp draining is now illegal. You develop your land on what the government considers a wetland, and they'll come in and fine you out of existence. Swamps are supposed to be allowed to flourish. Wetlands, draining of wetlands is illegal. In those days, they would drain swamps, clear out land, cut down trees. Farmers went from a 2-field rotation to a 3-field rotation. One year they'd farm field A and B and let field C lie idle. The next year they'd farm field B and C and let A lie idle. The third year they'd farm field A and C and let land B lie idle. Crop rotation. It was found that crops produced better and the land lasted longer that way. And of course today we have these fertilizers that do a lot to help replenish the nutrients in the soil. More and more the whole thing about this economic system was still primarily agrarian and still primarily rural. And a lot of persons were reduced to serfdom because all it would take, the way a lot of farmers live, they'll borrow the money at springtime to plant their crops with, and then come fall, they harvest and pay off what they borrowed, and then they have to turn right around and borrow again the next spring in order to live till harvest time. And all it takes, folks, is just one bad year, and they go under. It might be wars could destroy crops. An enemy would come in and destroy your crop and force you to go under. And a lot of farmers lost their land. A lot of their diet was based on bread. A lot of times what they do is they take their vegetables, such what few they had, and their meat, and put it on a slice of bread they had in front of them, and eat the bread and the stuff that was on the bread. But a lot of diet was based on bread. They consumed a lot of alcohol, ale, a lot of times they call it ale. And the drinking led to a lot of accidents. And a lot of the bodies we found, when we dig them up years later, found that these people, a lot of them died from mutilation by accidents, by falls. They would take risks that a sober man would not take, thinking it'll be all right, and they would work on a scaffold or work on a high building and fall down. But as time went on, the cities began to get bigger and better. And the cities would eventually become free from the lords. They'd obtain charters, become charter towns. European cities, though, were still small compared to Byzantine cities or Muslim cities. Eventually, the water in Europe became so polluted that the people had to drink from wells. And folks, fast forward to 2015 and tell me this is still true. You cannot drink water from Europe's streams or rivers. They have been polluted for centuries. Now, if they've changed that, then if any of you know of any change in that, you'd be welcome to let me know. Public baths were found in every town and village until the plagues that came in the 1300s closed them down. Eventually, they set up crafts as they began to move from the farm to city. You had three ranks: the apprentice, journeyman, and master. Apprentice, he was usually a child, someone learning a trade. He would run errands for the master, and he would learn to watch his master put something together. It might be a shoe, if he was a cobbler, or a horseshoe if he were a blacksmith. The journeyman, he actually did some of the work. The master, he ran the business. He did some of the work, but I mean, a lot of the work, the lower level work was done by the apprentice and journeyman. The master was usually a middle-aged or older man who had been in the business for a good many years. Eventually, they would form guilds. A guild reminds you somewhat of a trade union. The whole purpose behind the guild, they claimed to us, oh, we're going to guarantee quality products. That in order to be a guild, like if you belong to the Cobbler's Guild, cobbler being a shoemaker, that meant that you can make quality shoes, and any shoe you buy that was made by a person, a member of this guild, guarantees you'll have a top quality shoe. The other thing about the guilds were they were set up to keep down competition. They didn't want competition. Competition meant somebody might go out of business. But guilds were set up, in other words, unions, and then all the customers had to deal through the guild. Basically, a man would make a shoe and put it on display at the guild store, and the profits from all the shoes that were sold were distributed evenly among all the guild members, union members. There was a guarantee that nobody would be put out of business, that there would be no competition. It meant a certain amount of security. Fairs became a big thing in the Middle Ages, and they still are. Fairs are where people would go, merchants, and try to sell their merchandise. And of course, there are also places where people get together and drink and engage in revelry and oftentimes immorality. It was said that priests were often really busy after fair because people would come in and confess sins, and then they'd go out to the next fair and do the same things again. But they'd hold fairs 6 times a year. They did a lot to stimulate the economy, get money circulating, and stimulate trade. All right, so much for the life in the Middle Ages. Basic life, it was mostly agrarian, mostly farming, with a few professions, such as, again, the ones that come to my mind: shoemaker, horseshoe maker, blacksmith, clothing, weaver, shoemaker. Yeah, these were some of the professions that they would get into if they didn't want to farm. All right. Moving on to the church. The church was a big, big part of European history. The Pope became more and more secular as time went on. He behaved more like a king than he did a spiritual leader. He had secular duties. He was expected to make treaties, lead armies, conduct wars, just like the secular rulers did. Today, of course, Europe does not allow its popes to do that. But at this time, popes would get involved in political affairs. Church officials also often did the same thing. Bishops would fight nobility. Nobility would fight for bishops. Eventually, there came an agreement where the church became the church and where the state became the state, and the offices became separate. That was to come later. Saint Dominic set up an order of monks, an order of friars, did this in the 900s. the Dominics became heavily involved, among other things, in combating heresy. Now, basically, folk, this is one black mark on Europe. I mean, not everything was a bed of roses. Heresy was disagreement with church doctrine. And in those days, since there was only one church, it meant that if you were a heretic, much too often you would be burned at the stake for your crime. Heresy was considered a crime against not just the church, but against the state. Now, there's still such a thing as heresy, but if you're a member of a church and you're caught teaching some doctrine that the church does not allow, you can be kicked out of a church for heresy, but you can't be kicked out of you can't be punished for heresy. But heresy in those days was a crime. The Inquisition was set up. And folk, you'll hear about the Inquisition from time to time. The Inquisition resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of protesters. And I have a book at home that it's a copy of a book that my dad had that I still enjoy reading from time to time. And the book was written in the 1920s, and it said that not one pope has ever apologized for the Inquisition. That was true then, but since then, Pope John Paul II, recently, a few years back, did make what amounted to an apology for the Inquisition. Something that every group has done something that they are or should be ashamed of. And at least I can say this, Europeans can have a sense of shame or can admit that they were wrong. But there were calls for reform, and the church did everything it could initially to stop the reform. For the most part, though, your ordinary common man was allowed to live, grow up, marry, and die without being bothered by the Inquisition. Your richer people, your nobles, your higher-ups, middle class, they had to live in terror of the Inquisition. A lot of persons who were burned at the stake for heresy might not have been guilty. If a neighbor wanted to get you out of the way, he could go to a bishop and accuse you of heresy, and oftentimes you were burned at the stake without even being properly tried. And this is one reason why church courts have very little influence over the legal affairs today. The church courts are known to have killed a lot of people for the Inquisition. All right. Some of the top popes at this time. The most powerful pope who ever lived was Pope Innocent III. Innocent III even told the kings of Europe what they could and could not do. When King Philip Augustus, who, as you may know, is one of the most powerful kings of Europe, wanted to divorce his wife, Innocent sent him an order, you are not allowed to divorce your wife. And he forced King Philip Augustus to take back the wife he wanted to divorce. He told King John of England, who he could appoint as Archbishop of Canterbury. King John wanted to make his own appointment. The Pope said, no, I make those appointments and you don't. And even King John had to back down. To get his way, he used the interdict. He put territories who disagreed under the interdict, and once under the interdict, that meant everybody who died while the territory was under the interdict would go straight to purgatory and would stay there for many, many years. And no sacraments could be performed. No marriages were valid that were performed while the territory was in interdict. Persons who were about to die could not receive last rites. Yes?
What did you want us to write for interdict?
Basically, the interdict was a tool the church used, where the popes used to get their way. In other words, if you don't obey what I say, I'll put your land under an interdict. And in those days, they feared that a lot. Now, today, it's not used anymore. That's why I don't hear about it. For one thing, the church is very divided. And for another, the popes can only make suggestion. Even a pope cannot tell a civil magistrate, what to do and what not to do. Now, in addition, I mean, he killed more dissenters, more heretics. I mean, a person who committed heresy was called a heretic. He and his immediate successors killed more heretics than all other popes combined. For one thing, eventually popes were not allowed to kill heretics. Now, something else, and folk, I can never talk about indulgences without blushing. In a minute, you might know why. If any of you know anything about the sale of indulgences, essentially, what it became, initially it was simply where that you could pay money to the church, and this money would free a loved one from purgatory. So if you felt like it, you know, this husband of mine had a few sins. I mean, he was a good man. He had a few sins, so I'll pay the church some money to get his soul out of purgatory. But it eventually became a means by which you could guarantee your own salvation, or that you could buy forgiveness for sins with money. So basically what this amounts to is if you wanted to commit a certain sin, you'd go to a priest and tell him what sin you wanted to commit. The priest, you would haggle over the price. I mean, if the bigger sins, of course, meant you had to pay more money. Then the priest would write you out a bill of indulgency. You'd pay the priest. And both you and the priest knew that you were going to go out and at least try to commit the sin that you had just purchased forgiveness for. Now, if you think there's something bad about the theology, everybody today does too. And I must hasten to state that the Catholic Church does not sell indulgences anymore, has not for centuries. Because one day, this practice of the sale of indulgences bumped head first into a certain man who got him stopped. Anybody know which man I'm talking about? Martin Luther, yeah. Martin Luther and indulgences had a head-to-head clash one time. And by the time it happened, most of Europe was ready to stop indulgences. Until today, Catholic and Protestant alike agreed that the sale of indulgences was unwise or wrong. But before that happened, St. Peter's, magnificent place, you know, where the popes live and where the popes are chosen, St. Peter's was largely built from money collected from the sale of indulgences. Anyway, indulgences were started during the reign of Innocent III. Started out small at first, then grew and grew and grew until they became somewhat of a scandal in Europe. Universities. Oh yeah, very important. And a lot of persons. Now, folk, we have to, I mean, there's been many books written about this. We have to wonder why it was that Europeans, more than others, began to burst out. I mean, if you could have visited the world in the year 1000, you'd find, and I'd say this being a European myself, you'd find Europeans were the most uncouth, dirtiest, unlearned people on the globe. That was in the year 1000. Fast forward to 1500, Europeans are the ones who are spreading out over the globe and conquering and developing scientifically. What happened between times? Well, one thing was that the universities were built. You know, Europeans were interested in learning. Now, you didn't have universities in other parts of the world before this time. Essentially, a university is where a bunch of knowledgeable people would get together and teach their knowledge to younger folk. At first, the university consisted of maybe one teacher who would collect a few students around him. Then other teachers would join in, and so on. The first university we know about started in Bologna, Italy. The university then moved throughout Italy. The first university north of the Alps went from, well, it was started in Paris. The king got involved. The king said, I'm going to collect scholars, and this became something that European kings would do. They collect scholars together in hopes of advancing knowledge. And folk, in our United States Constitution, there's a provision where that the government is allowed to promote the arts and sciences by giving government money to it. And this school and all state colleges exist because of government money. This school is supported by government money. But the governments, with the kings, would set up universities and pick some of the more brilliant people to learn, or the more brilliant people to teach and others to learn. And they wound up getting 3-degree programs, the bachelor's, the master's, and the doctorate. The associate came later. Three degrees. Bachelor's degree, don't write this much down, but meant that you were knowledgeable in a field. Master's degree meant you were qualified to teach, at least teach adult students. Doctorate meant you knew as much as could be known about this subject. Now, what the universities led to was what we call specialization, where the people would begin to learn more and more about less and less. At one time, people had a broad liberal arts education. You would consider educated, had a broad education. But then you wound up specializing in ones that might be theology. The number one thing that was taught in those days was theology or philosophy. Eventually, science was introduced. But the university system started during this period of time, the High Middle Ages. The scholastics, their favorite topic was Aristotle. He's the Greek philosopher who did a lot. Now, folk, scholasticism was largely looking backward, and this, they had something that we today would consider unusual. They said that the knowledge that mankind had was better back yonder than it is today. Now, of course, we think the reverse. And therefore, to get knowledge, we need to look back in time to the ancients. And one thing I've tried to emphasize in these classes I teach, every time I've taught a class in world history first semester, and I've taught about 40 of them now, I try to emphasize there appears to have been a time when man's knowledge was very, very, very great way back yonder. I think these people realized it, I think we don't. But they would look backward to ancient times, thinking that we'll learn more by studying the ancients because they knew more than we did. Today, we don't. We look at nature, or we try to get our body of knowledge from our own studies because we think we know more than our ancestors did. And in some cases, we do at least more than our immediate ancestors. Now, along comes one of the greatest scholastics of all time, St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas, and most of you have probably never heard of him. He's largely forgotten about, except among medieval students, but he was one of several men down through the ages who have attempted to explain everything. He said that there's no question we can't answer, and he wanted to explain the universe. And as such, he goes in a class along with men like Plato and Newton and Einstein, even though today, we would not consider him near the equal of Newton or Einstein. But his explanation of the universe involved a whole lot of theology, which is why the Catholics call him St. Thomas Aquinas. You can help with the Saint here. St. Thomas Aquinas. But he believed, along with Plato, along with Newton, along with Einstein, that they could explain the whole universe. Now, I want to elaborate on that a little bit. There have been a few scientists in modern times who say that there's some things that we're just not going to explain. Now, in 1950, the year after I was born, some scientists wrote that we almost can explain it. Now, there's still a few things we're a little bit rusty on, a few things we debate, but we had split the atom, we had dropped an atomic bomb, we were using a nuclear reactor. We just about can explain everything in the universe. And then fast forward to 2015, and a lot of the explanations that they had in 1950 have proven to be false, wrong. And I listen to stuff and read books from time to time. that we don't have any workable theory to explain that anything in the universe that will fit every situation. Quantum, if you ever studied quantum physics, have any of you done any dabbling in quantum mechanics or quantum theory? It almost appears that the quanta will behave one way when they think we're observing it, and these same quanta behave differently when we're not observing it. So, hey, that sounds metaphysical. Well, I can show you documentation where this is known to be true. It's known that on a quantum level, if you shine a ray this way, and then right here turn this ray from white to red, and shine another ray this way, at the same distance that this one turns red over here, this one will turn red over here. Why? There is no good explanation. It's almost like if we believe that every atom in the universe interacts instantaneously with every other atom, even the ones trillions of light years away. Basically, the more we learn, the more we realize, hey, we don't know anything for sure on a theoretical level. We've developed a lot of gadgets, but in your study of electricity, and I've studied electricity, there's one basic question that some beginning student, only beginning student will ask it. If you ever take a course in electronics, don't bother asking. Which direction does electricity flow? Don't ask. Nobody knows. We thought we knew until the invention of the transistor. The invention of the transistor upset every theory we had. I mean, we thought the electricity flows from negative to positive. Now we think maybe the voltage puts pressure one way and the current flows the other. But we don't know that. Basically, but anyway, he believed he could tell you how many angels could stand on the head of a needle, on the head of a pen. He believed he could answer every question. All right, anyway, leaving that. Latin language began to be replaced by, and I'm going to use the word you'll see as you study it, by the vernacular. The word vernacular means your local language. In other words, the people in French could study their language in college in the French tongue. The English people would study in the English tongue. You do not have to learn everything in Latin anymore. Cathedrals. Cathedrals were built three types. Two types: Romanesque and Gothic. Now, the word Gothic has nothing to do with the Goths. Very important, folk, because at the same time that Christians were building their magnificent cathedrals in Europe, the Buddhists were building their magnificent cathedrals in India, and a lot of persons wondered, was there any kind of contact between the Christians and the Buddhists? But the Romanesque, they had barrel roofs, and in other words, the roof shaped like a barrel. They were rounded roofs, and they were sturdy, but they were dark inside. The Gothic cathedrals, on the other hand, had pointed arches, and between the arches they could put stained glass windows, so they were usually well lit. Well lit inside, at least in the daytime. The Romanesque were dark with their rounded roofs. Everything about the Gothic cathedral seemed to point skyward. In other words, you'd have a pointed roof here, another point over here. Your book shows pictures of them. They were usually pointed skyward. All right. Moving on now to chapter 13. Starts off with the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was what was left of the Roman Empire after the Roman Empire fell. It was started by King Constantine, the one who converted to Christianity. When Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, its capital was at Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was, of course, Christian, having been started by a Christian, but it had no distinction between church and state. No distinction between church and state. The Byzantine Empire fought long wars with Persia, which after about 600 years, in other words, you'd think, one of the things that destroyed the Roman Empire, folk, was its wars in the Middle East that were expensive. And guess what? We're fighting wars in the Middle East right now that prove to be expensive. Well, these wars bring us down too. But the wars forced the Byzantine emperors to tax their people heavily, and this led to a lot of grumbling and discontent and impoverished the empire. Eventually, a Byzantine emperor decisively defeated the Persians, but it weakened both empires and led to the Muslims coming out of Arabia and conquering eventually, well, they first conquered the Persian Empire and eventually conquered the Byzantine Empire also. However, before that time, the first Byzantine emperor to amount to anything was Justinian. Justinian almost rebuilt the empire, the Roman Empire. He conquered most of the Mediterranean. He even had southern Italy as part of his domain. He's remembered for his law code. And his law code was used in Europe throughout much of the Middle Ages. King Henry II told his judges, and Henry of England, you can use the law of Justinian if you can't find the law in our law books to cover your case. But his laws became the foundation for Western law until the year 1453 when the empire died. But Justinian's empire did not live long after him. 3 years after he died, his empire had largely crumbled. Part of it was a plague hit the empire, and in those days plagues would come and last maybe 50 years until they burned themselves out. A plague hit the empire. Then the treasury was emptied, the population declined, and Islam threatened. Islam seized Syria and Palestine, took that from the Byzantine Empire. Then came the Bulgars, the modern country of Bulgaria. The Bulgars came from Mongolia, and they threatened the Byzantine Empire. All told, the Bulgars conquered the Danube region of Europe, which had belonged to the Byzantines. All told, the Byzantine Empire was greatly reduced in size. Now, the Byzantine Empire eventually came to be known as the Greek Empire, along with the church. In the year 1054, and don't write the date down, but eventually the church split. You had the Greek Orthodox Church, and it split off from the Roman Church. The split remains. They remain split to this day. They've been apart for 1,000 years. Greek Orthodox Catholic, Roman Catholic. The Greek Orthodox never could separate church from state. Now, Greek Orthodox spread throughout the Balkan regions and into Russia. They converted to Russians. I mentioned how that Vladimir converted to Orthodoxy. But everywhere, and I say this, folk, as a matter of historical fact, not a matter of opinion, everywhere where the Greek Orthodox have been, if the Muslims haven't taken over, the communists have. You can defend them by saying, well, it's the geographical location. They were located in such a way that they were closer to any Mongolians would have passed through their territory before coming to Europe, and they served as a buffer for the rest of Europe. All that is true. But still, the fact is, everywhere that they have been, and you can often wonder why. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, but anyway, I won't give my reason. It's not that important. because this is a brief overview. But they had their problems. Rome did too. The Greek Orthodox Catholic are like Roman Catholic, but different in a couple of regards. Number one, they allow their clergy to marry. Roman Catholicism does not. But their clergymen are allowed to marry. And number two, they do not claim the Pope is supreme. Roman Catholics insist that the Pope must be supreme. Greek Orthodox do not. Those are two of the main differences. Anyway, they became Greek Orthodox, and the church and empire became known as the Greek Empire. The emperor was in charge of the church, and again, folk, this proved to be a really costly mistake. They never did separate church from state, and as a result, the church became nothing more than a tool of the state. You might say, why is it important? Well, it's like this. In our country, we have three branches of government. We have our president, we have our Congress, we have our judges, and they're all three independent of each other, and each of them keep each other in check. If all of a sudden the dictatorship would take over, the president would start telling the judges what to do. The president then could tell the Congress how to vote, and there'd be no independent, no check and balance on the president. When the church is nothing more than a tool of the state, the church cannot serve as a check or balance of the state, and the result is church and state oftentimes just both go downhill in a pile. When church and state are separate, it benefits both church and state. The church can voice its dissent against the state, which in turn just might have the effect, because the church, at least throughout history, was powerful, which might have the effect of making emperors and kings think 2 or 3 times before they make a move that most people would consider immoral. But the Byzantine Empire never separated church from state. Anyway, the split occurred in 1054, and don't worry about the date, but the Pope excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope. And I've heard that there are 5 patriarchs. Well, they say, when the Byzantines meet, the Byzantine patriarchs meet, they put down 5 chairs. One is for the Patriarch of Constantinople, one is for the Patriarch of Jerusalem, one is for the Patriarch of Antioch, one is for the Patriarch of Alexandria. That's 4. The 5th is for the Pope. And tell the Pope, you're welcome to come and join if you're willing to sit down just like one of us. But if you want to be the head, stay home. For more than 1,000 years, the Pope has stayed home. He said, if I can't be the head, I'm not going to attend. But they put down the 5 chairs, and one of them has been empty for 1,000 years. I mean, the reason the 5 cities, or the 5 big cities that Constantine appointed at the time in 312, because they were the 5 chief cities of the empire: Alexandria, Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, because it was where Christianity started, and Antioch, where the Christians were first called Christians. 5 patriarchs. All right, anyway, not long after they split, the Byzantine emperor found himself into some serious trouble. And he realized he couldn't handle the Muslims and the Bulgars who were encroaching on him. So he called a crusade. The emperor's name was Alexis. Alexis appealed to the Pope, will you please come and help me fight against the Muslims? And this led to the Crusades. The Pope was to, all told, send about 200 crusades, various popes. All right, back to the Crusades again. I've mentioned them already. I want you to remember, folks, the Crusades, the only one that was a victory for Europeans was the first one. The first crusade conquered the Holy Land. The second crusade was a flop. That was the one that King Louis VII of France led along with his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, but that was a flop. The third crusade was led by Richard the Lionhearted of England. It was also a flop because it started off with 3 kings: Philip Augustus and Richard and Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, went along. If they could have kept their armies together, they might have conquered Islam. As it was, Philip Augustus turned back, Frederick Barbarossa was drowned, and Richard was no match for Saladin. Now, the third crusade, it involved the Islamic leader Saladin. S-A-L-A-S. Who was one of the greatest leaders of all time. Now, folks, again, I want to say this about the Muslim world. Fast forward to 2015. If Islam could find itself a leader that could be agreed to by all sides, I hesitate to say what they could do to the rest of the world. But so far, they're spending their time fighting each other. But if they could find a man whom they call the 12th Imam, I mean, if I talk about Imams, I believe, there were 11. Then came the 12th one, the 12th one disappeared. And if the 12th Imam ever appears back up, or someone who claims to be the 12th Imam, and all of Islam were to flock to him, again, I don't know what would happen, folk, and nobody really knows what would happen. But in the case of Saladin, they had a leader here that they could agree to follow. Now, the Fourth Crusade, that was the one that turned on and sacked Constantinople. Sacked. The Byzantine Empire never recovered from the damage done by its fellow Christians. So basically, you had Christian turn against Christian, and the Muslims laughed out loud. But the Fourth Crusade was called to help Constantinople fight against the Muslims. And here, the Christians from Europe turned on, and sacked Constantinople. And eventually, this was to lead to the Byzantine Empire crumbling. Now, folks, there's something I want to mention. Your book doesn't, but it's called a Children's Crusade. Now, folk, I'm the father of 3 children myself, and it's hard for me to explain what would lead parents to allow their children, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 17 years old, to go off on a crusade. But about 50,000 children, most of them from Germany, got together, and they said, we believe we can do what the grown-ups could not do. The crusade never got to Constantinople. Every one of the children either died or were sold into slavery. Again, it sounds unreal, but folks, the Children's Crusade actually happened. They came in 2 large groups, about 25,000 in one group and 25,000 in another. And as far as hardly any, at least no significant number of them ever got back home. Again, just some kind of a megalomania took over. Megalomania is excessive religious zeal, took over Europe, and somehow parents just released their children. Oh yeah, the children consisted not just of boys and girls alike went along. Youngsters marched toward Jerusalem. None of them ever got to Constantinople. Now, when I was at UT, I had a teacher who was he was the world's expert on crusades, top 5 expert, and he'd even written articles for the Encyclopedia American and Encyclopedia Britannica on the Crusades. And he would tell us that my article appears in Encyclopedia Britannica such and such, and yet he had a few articles there. You won't see it in recent Britannica. He had a few articles on the Crusades. He was hard against them. He said, I can't see where the Crusades did anybody any good. They were harmful to both sides. Well, here's a couple of things that they did for Europe. Number one, out of the Crusades came the institution of the hospital. There came a monastic order called the Knights Hospitallers. And again, hey, they do some good. I mean, most of us, if we haven't already, will spend some time in a hospital. I have. And probably most of you, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but even younger people spend time in hospitals. Most of us are born in hospitals. But anyway, the Knights Hospitallers started the institution we call the hospital. That has been, and also banking came about. Also, with so many of the nobles off fighting, kings that stayed behind in Europe were able to build up their power. Now granted, some kings went on crusades, but eventually kings abandoned the crusading zeal but kings were able to build up their power while the nobles were absent. So this led to the rise of nation states. All told, now again with all respect to Dr. Fink, my teacher, and he's gone now, my teacher at UT, who was so hard against the crusades, I wonder what he would think now. I mean, folk, maybe as a result of things that are happening right now in the world today, where that Christians are being slaughtered just for the crime of being Christian, and Christians are being crucified. Maybe some of us can better understand why the world would decide to take up and fight against the type of people that at some point we're going to have to fight against. I mean, what I just now said was something I couldn't even have said 2 years ago. But they are showing us these, particularly the terrorists, I'll call them terrorists now, why that it's necessary at some point the world is going to have to get together, unite. And I mean, I have a book in my house that predicts that eventually there's going to be a world war between terrorism and the rest of the world. And he doesn't dare make a prediction who will win. Could the terrorists win? Yes, if they get hold of the right weapons in the right places. And guess who's going to wind up supplying them the weapons? But States of America. Yes. But again, folks, I feel like I much better understand than I did even 2 or 3 years ago why the Crusaders went on the Crusades. The enemy they were fighting was real, and there was also a case, instead of letting the enemy come to you and fight on your territory, you just take the fight. I mean, it's like in a football game. You try to take the ball to the other fellow's territory. Don't just go to the 50-yard line and the coach tell you, oh, we're going to stop the 50-yard line, folks. We think the game will be safer that way. So try to hold them at the 50 and don't let them take any of your territory past the 50. And we won't go to the territory past 50. The game is not won that way. And I got something to say about wars. Wars aren't won that way either. Basically, it was simply Europe was taking up the offensive against its enemies that were coming in on it. They were going to take the fight. They didn't win, but they at least became the aggressor instead of letting them be hemmed in. Now, out of the Crusades came a group called the Knights Templar, or the Templars. I told you I'd mention them, so I'll mention them now. Now, I tell you, don't write this down. This will not be on the test, but I just feel I have to mention them. The Templars became very powerful. Suppose they found a secret. The secret that they supposedly found was the secret of collecting vast amounts of money through banking. And they got the trust of Europeans, where even kings banked with them. And they became really powerful, but they would have nothing to do with charity. And you get rich people who won't show any interest in distributing the wealth to the poor. The poor eventually rise up against it. What eventually happened was King Philip the Fair. I told you I'd mention him again. Well, here he is. Philip the Fair one day decided he wanted to join the Templars. I mean, his wife had died, and he had to be unmarried to become a Knights Templar, because the Templars were a monastic order. But with his wife dead, he felt like he could join, so he applied to join, and the Templars blackballed him. He had 5 of his knights infiltrate Templars, saying, I know they're going to swear, he seeks to swear their oaths, but report back to me what to do. And these knights infiltrated and came back to Philip and reported some things. I mean, these Templars in their secret meetings were engaging in sex with each other, and then folk even said they were engaging in sex with demons. I mean, that's what the knights reported back to the king. The king wrote a letter of this to the Pope, and the king and Pope got together and said the Templars must be destroyed. And on Friday the 13th, all the Templars were lined up, except that some of them fled to Scotland, one of my ancestors. There they were instrumental in helping the King of Scotland become independent. I mean, basically, King Edward II of England, who had an army of 20,000 men, met with Robert Bruce of Scotland. And then up came these hooded knights over the horizon. And King Edward II, well, hey, these are not my friends, so he fled the battlefield. Anybody know what happens to a battle when your king When King Edward fled, his entire army fled. And therefore, when King Edward and his army fled, the Templars just disappeared back where they came from. I mean, we believe there were Templars. They were masked, hooded knights in white gowns. Their white gowns covered their armor, but we believe they were Templars. The Templars decided to reform their ways. They set up some charity, and they founded what we now call the Scottish Rite Hospital, again, Scotland. And the Scottish Rite Hospital helps crippled children walk. The Templar treasury was supposedly buried in the land across the sea. And folks, there have been many a person look for it here. The Templar treasury, which consists of maybe billions of dollars worth of silver and gold, has never been found. And every once in a while there'll be a documentary about attempts to find it, particularly in Nova Scotia. It's a most serious attempt. Any of you heard about any of this? Okay, at least one hand is going up. Two persons, one person already. Anyway, you've heard of it now. I mean, it's not going to be on a test. Don't memorize it, but I just thought I'd throw it in because to me it's very interesting. Did they have a secret? You look up on an encyclopedia and the encyclopedia will say, no, it's generally believed there was no secret that they found. Well, they did seem to find the secret of amassing a lot of wealth. Anyway, eventually the Templars were able to build their nation that they wanted, the ideal nation. This ideal nation, folk, is known as the United States of America. You might say, how's that? The Templars changed their name to Freemasons. And every one of our founding fathers was a Freemason. $1 bill, Freemason symbol, the Egyptian pyramid. Again, have any of you ever heard any hints of any of this? Okay, a few heads are nodding, and you've heard this, yeah. But anyway, I just thought I'd tell you because, again, you read the right books, they'll talk about it. The ideal state now was to be a state where a person would become leader by his own abilities, not by being born into it. And every leader on every level would become a leader by their own abilities, not being born into it. And they could not do this in Europe, where the blue blood was prized highly, royal blood was prized very highly, bloodlines. They had to get in another continent and where they could start all over and set up a continent where the nobility would not be allowed and where that you could get ahead by your own, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. And again, their ideal state that they are said to have found, we know of as the United States of America. All right. We'll start next time with the 14th century, the Black Death. Folk, before we leave, one thing I want to say, what was, in my mind anyway, and your book will mention what was the number one cause of the Black Death that carried away a large percentage of the population in India, China, and Europe? What was the number one cause? Climate change. In what direction? It went colder. Climate change. Folks, this is standard history. Now, this is not conspiracy stuff. The climate cooled down. That's standard. And it led to all kinds of problems. All right.